It's a privilege to welcome on stage the co-founder and CTO of Confluent and co-creator of Apache Kafka, Neha.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.
So excited to be here.
So, Apache Kafka,
Yeah.
how did it all start? What led to the creation of Apache Kafka?
You know, it's really a funny story. Apache Kafka didn't start off as, a great idea that we just had one day at LinkedIn. It was very much a business need back then. And this was almost 10 years ago, I remember. There were really two trends playing out at LinkedIn. The first one was, what's the main hub for the data, right? And we were used to that being the data warehouse, but back then there was Hadoop, there were no SQL databases coming in rapidly, there were search systems, our graph database, and all of those systems needed access to the same data and needed it quickly. At the same time, the second trend was there was a lot of variety of data sources. So data wasn't just coming from our databases, it was coming from applications and events and network pings. And so the real problem we were tackling is, well, how do we unify these two worlds, right? If you take a step back, we really had a big chasm we were looking at. There's the application world that uses databases and MQs. There's the data world that uses ETL tools and analytics. And the chasm is really what we were trying to bridge. That's the developer asked to us. And so we had to do something about it. But we didn't really want to build anything new. So we said, well, let's go and hack the existing systems, try to make it work, right? Like we went through the MQs, we tried to retrofit that. We looked at ETL tools. And then we failed at all that and realized that there are core architectural problems with that we couldn't have retrofitted it with. And so we had no other choice but to build Kafka. And so here we are, years down the line. It's in thousands of companies around the world.
Congratulations.
It's been exciting. Thank you.
Congratulations. How many years was that? When did Apache Kafka first come out?
I think, I remember pushing the first version to production in 2009, I think summer of 2009. So maybe next year it would be 10 years of Kafka. Reminder to, go back to the team and say we should do something big about it.
And when did you realize you could start an open core business on top of it? Confluent.
Ooh, that's interesting too. So, rewinding back to, when Kafka became successful, when we pushed it to production, it was really our way of proving to management is that this is, a real thing, that this can do what our previous systems did and it is better. So back then, what we realized is, this is not just LinkedIn's problem. This is a problem that every digital company is going to have. Is very rapidly, your developers want to bridge these two worlds, and Kafka is the only way to do that. And so we said that we want to open source it, and that was LinkedIn's culture. So in the first 2 years, like any infrastructure technology, you have to crack the Silicon Valley tech segment, right? Like you have to go in and convince these companies to adopt it, and that's what happened in the first 2 years. But in the 2 years after that, Fortune 500 companies started to pick it up, and we found ourselves very frequently talking to them and helping them with their problems. So I remember one day I was sitting on this call with a big telecom company, helping them with their Kafka use in the middle of their business. And that's when I realized it's like, wow, this is Kafka's mission critical. It's kind of a big deal. And if we wanted to really see it go mainstream, we couldn't have done it at LinkedIn. We had all these ideas about how to build a product around it. And so that was a time when I went to both of my then team members and said, well, what do you think about creating a company around this? And then a year down the line, we had Confluent.
That's exciting.
It was exciting. Again, a very byproduct of that being the only way of seeing Kafka everywhere.
So obviously, you being the co-founder and the CTO of Confluent, I assume your role has been changing a lot since the early days up until now. How many people is Confluent now?
I think we're about a little less than 400 And we just turned 4. So maybe 100 a year is what we did at Confluent. My role has evolved a lot. I think a lot more than any other exec role is the CTO role that evolves a lot, mostly because it's really ill-defined compared to a lot of other exec roles. Like, every other role has like a job function, and sure, the scope of the job function changes, but the function itself doesn't. The CTO role is very different. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. Early days, a CTO is very inward focused, right? You're helping lay the foundation. You're hiring your early engineers. You're actually running engineering. And that stops scaling after a while, right? So your job really at that point in time, I realized, is to hire yourself out of some of those roles. And so something I learned that I wish I could have done sooner is to actually get a VPN way sooner than we otherwise did, right? The other thing I think stops scaling is you can't always be in the details. So, right, writing code, reviewing code, making all the key architectural decisions. It's my philosophy that if you're doing that, then what is your engineering team doing, right? How do they feel empowered, right? And so I think as the company starts growing, your role becomes more outward focused. So talking to customers, keeping a reality check on your ideas, partnering with your head of product. I think that's a point where most CTOs don't actually like that part of the job. So they continue to remain inward focused, and that's OK. Right? You pick some part of the software stack, you continue to be involved. Not many CTOs take the role I took. So I run product for the company. Which means I get to influence product strategy, what is open source, what is commercial. A lot of technology and product decisions are actually quite the same at Confluent because it's infrastructure technology. So I think it probably makes sense for Confluent, but that's a point where I see a lot of outward-facing CTOs go and evangelize for the company, talk to customers. It's just so different from the early days when you're kind of inward-focused.
When the CTO becomes the chief sales officer.
Yeah. I'm sure that's fun too.
So, the industry, it's so changing so rapidly. There are so many emerging technologies, emerging trends. What, in your mind, what is the state of architectures?
That's quite a broad question, but if I rewind back and you just look at the last decade, right, I think software trends always take root in business trends. So if you look at the last decade, there's been rise of the public cloud, emergence of IoT, there's been dominance of mobile over web that has completely changed customer expectations. And there's also been just the digitization of enterprise, right? Like brick and mortar companies becoming digital ones. And so I think that has really influenced a couple of software trends. Something that's really relevant to this conference and Kong here is I see the monolith is being broken down into microservices. And you can argue that that has a root in all of those business trends, right? Like all of them, they're pushing developers to be more empowered, to run faster. And we know all the upsides of microservices, but there are real operational challenges, right? You have to solve a lot of problems. I mean, Kong is trying to solve it at the API management layer, but then there's also a real cultural change that needs to happen in enterprises. You have to have all the DevOps tools necessary to succeed, with microservices, which is where the second trend comes in, and I see this quite a lot, is just this, standardization and emergence of a totally new operating system for the whole data center, which is Kubernetes now, but for a while it was Mesos and a couple other tools. And I think that's interesting too. That's leading to all these other software trends of continuous delivery, infrastructure as code. Companies are new to this, but they're rapidly adopting it. There are lots of other trends to talk about, but mostly also the rise of the public cloud and the rise of serverless as a computing trend. I think that's really going to happen as people adopt the public cloud. Infrastructure complexity gets pushed down, to some other layer, and you're really trying to drive down the total cost of ownership. Trying to build elastic applications. I'm pretty sure in the next couple of years, some part of your software stack is going to be functions as a service. Mm-hmm. Not as much as what the public cloud providers evangelize, because I think half the stack is still going to be stateful applications. And that's the last and final trend that I might want to mention here is the emergence of event-driven architectures, right? I think the world of n-tier architectures where applications store all their state in a database and communicate only through request response and MQs, I think that's been rapidly supplemented because you have all these microservices. You have to decouple them, right? They don't work very well when they're all tightly coupled to the database. So I see that quite a lot is, Kafka being like the streaming backbone for microservices, almost a central nervous system for the enterprise. There are a lot more, but I think like we're trying to move up the value chain, right? Once you get access to data, there's machine learning, there's automation.
And this is a very valid point. When we talk about microservices, we are used to think about service-to-service communication,
Yep.
but that doesn't have necessarily to always be the case, right? Event-driven architectures, for example, can work better in some specific use cases.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And that's another myth is one doesn't replace the other, right? It really is all about supplementing. And if you think about a retail business, you're not just placing that order, which is a transaction and it has to be request response. You're actually doing a lot of things in the background. You're repricing your products. If you want to be Amazon, that's what these companies are trying to do. You're trying to fill your distribution centers, trying to track your supply chain. All that is event-driven, right? I think that's where the Amazon model really scales is through the event-driven architecture.
And so, in your vision of the industry, what role do you think open source will have?
Oh, wow, that's one of my favorite topics to talk about. Curious to hear your views as well. I think we all understand what open source does for the community, and it's been amazing, right, to watch that is have so many big trends just make it into the developer ecosystem as fast as possible because there's open source, as a way to drive that community. But I think open source plays a very different role for different players of the ecosystem. And the best one is the empowering the developer, right? In a random company, developers actually didn't make a lot of the software decisions. And that has changed in a really big way. Developers really make a decision to use a software, grounds up that becomes important. Then the company is forced to support it and get help for it. And that is really different. And I think open source has really fueled that trend. That's one player. The other player is sponsors, creators of that open source project, whether they're vendors or not. I think open source has given us the fastest way to distribute that software into the world. Right? And that's another thing where I see people conflate, like, is open source a business model or is it a go-to-market strategy? And I've always said that it's a distribution strategy. It's not really a business model in any real sense of the word. And you'll see that play out in the relative success of companies like Mongo and Elastic relative to some of the Hadoop companies, right? That's really that distinction. But the third emerging player in ecosystem of open source is the public cloud providers. And open source has given them like a really low-cost way of growing their business without having to contribute anything at all back to the ecosystem. Right? And I think you asked about the future of open source, and I think getting that dynamic right as a whole community is going to be really important, right? Like if you look at any successful open source project, there are lots of people in the community, but the most successful ones are the ones that have like strong backers, right? There's one entity that's really sponsoring the project. And in order for a company to do that, right, you're going to have to, commercialize, like have some way of funding that kind of R&D, right? And so one way of doing that is to actually protect the code from being commoditized so quickly, right? With all these, variety of different restrictive open source licenses. I think that's a really interesting debate at this point in time to talk about when it comes to open source is AGPL and Commons Clause and the whole, controversy around it, right? It's unfortunately not in favor of the people who are really cultivating the ecosystem. And so I think in order for the future of open source to be still very successful, we're going to have to get that dynamic right as a community.
Yeah, so Joseph Jacks told me yesterday, we had a panel about Kubernetes. He's like, how, software is eating the world. open source is eating software.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And then the public cloud is eating all that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I also think that one of the reasons why open source is ultimately better for the industry is that open source really has to be simple to be adopted, right? In order to have a successful open source project, we need to have that top of the funnel adoption. And you cannot have that if it's not simple to use and if it's not fixing a real problem developers have.
Yeah, I think you really see that in the velocity. That's exactly right, right? If it's closed source, it's whatever, as fast as one entity could move it and evolve it, right? And the reason we see so many successful open source projects is really because a much broader ecosystem is trying to push the different corners, trying to make it better, right? I think that really plays out in the quality and also just how fast it makes it into the mainstream and makes it into a higher quality, adoption.
And when it comes to open core, that's also perhaps even changing the way we're selling software. Because now the customer, it's not necessarily the CIO, the CTO anymore, is the actual engineer, the developer.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I think that's the biggest thing that we had to learn, when we formed Confluent is you hear all these, different people giving you lots of advice on how to sell into the enterprise, and ultimately that's what people want to sell into. Is the old model was very much, you go pitch to the C-levels, you get the CIO bought in or the CTO bought in, and then boom, like they push it down, right, into their whole organization. And that's just, the whole open source model has flipped it on its head, right? You actually start with the developers. You're more so farming your way up, the value chain in an enterprise. Is you're convincing the developers, then the tech lead, then the directors, then the VPs who actually sign the checks. And then ultimately, if your software is really going to make it through the company, you get the buy-in of the C-levels, right? And that actually changes completely how sales works. Is it's not the usual model anymore. You have to get very different kinds of salespeople. It changes, almost entirely how you do marketing. Is you actually market to developers. You have to make sense to us, right, on how this project helps me, right, achieve its value. It's just so different from how you would talk to, a super hands-off C-level at a Fortune 500, right? I think that balance is so critical.
Which in turn also causes a shift in power within the enterprise, because now developers have so much more power to decide what goes in production. It's
absolutely
bottom-up disruption almost, right?
Absolutely. I think there are so many funny stories of, when people call into Confluent, it's very much like, we're going to production, and like the timeline is like the next 3 months, and so we need help now. And that is like such a, critical trigger, that happens. But their developers actually made that decision like a year ago, and now they realize that they just have to, they're forced into it almost, right? You still have to deliver after that, like, the first relationship is not the end of it, but it really does change I think, the power chain quite a bit.
Yeah. So there are future CTOs in the audience. What is the best advice you would like to give them?
Oh my, I don't know if I'm the best person to give a lot of advice, but I'll say a few things that might be useful for future co-founders and maybe even CTOs is to really focus on getting the initial team right. I can't stress enough on how much it matters to get the right co-founding team to begin with. Investors usually invest in founder credibility, and the odds are just disproportionately higher if you land the right co-founder. So, I would say spend a lot more time on that decision than you otherwise would. This so much advice, beyond the founding phase, product market fit and distribution strategies, sales and marketing. I think there's plenty of good advice out there. So I'll just share my philosophy on founding companies is to, really make sure that that company is like the only vehicle to see the change you want to see in the world, to see your mission actually succeed. In the Valley, this order is quite reversed a lot of times, where people decide that they want to be entrepreneurs first, and then they're looking for that next crazy idea, and then a team to form that idea. I think the reason it's a little bit weaker is because this whole excitement of being an entrepreneur, it actually wears off in just the first year. And then in order to get through the hard days, which are, I think, majority of the days, you really need that determination that this company is like the only way to see the change, and what you want to see is that change, right? So that's the order I would form a company in. That's at least hard learned from experience. I would be curious to hear your story a little bit.
My story?
Yeah, and like your advice, right? Like I think your advice in the early days of a startup is just so different from 4 years down the line.
I would say that my biggest advice as CTO of Kong, and perhaps the biggest lesson I've learned, is to give trust. Right? When you're the CTO in the early days, you're used to make every single decision
Yep.
within the organization, within the
Right.
product, within the vision.
Right.
And eventually that doesn't scale. And
Couldn't
eventually
agree more.
we'll have to find somebody that can execute on that vision, make it better. But most importantly, we'll have to give them the chance to do that by releasing control of the project and giving trust. Right?
I really like that. I think I learned that also, and really that's the only way to scale a company.
And it's the only way to make the
that.
product better even,
I-
almost, right? Because then you have much more variety of contributions, from other people as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Releasing that trust. Well, thank you very much. This was amazing.
Of
Congratulations.
course. Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.